Welcome to Well Read. I'm your host, Justin Chapman. It's been a while since the last episode, as I've been working on my other TV show, Pasadena Monthly, formerly known as News Wrap Local, which you can watch every fourth Friday of the month on Pasadena Media's cable channels, streaming apps, and YouTube. But I have a special guest today, so I wanted to bring him in for a special episode of Well Read. Let's get right to it. Let's patch in our guest, Irish journalist and author Fintan O'Toole. His latest book is called We Don't Know Ourselves, A Personal History of Modern Ireland. It was released in 2021, and the paperback edition just came out this month. He's a longtime columnist for the Irish Times and a professor at Princeton University. He's a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books and The Guardian, and he's the author of 19 books, including The Politics of Pain. So your new book, We Don't Know Ourselves, really fascinating. I'm a dual Irish citizen, and I consider myself a student of Ireland, and I'm learning all kinds of new things in this book. It's quite epic. It covers such a long period of time from the 1950s to the present day. When did you start working on this book? I read somewhere it was 40 years in the making.
Well, in a way it is, yeah, because as you mentioned, I've been obviously writing about Ireland professionally really since the early 1980s, so in a way, the material, the stories, the events are very much things that I've covered and written about, but I suppose what was different really with this was I'm sure, like yourself as a journalist, you don't put a lot of yourself into stuff directly, and I just thought that maybe there was a way of telling the story of Ireland's remarkable transformation in my lifetime by not just kind of using my own journalistic resources, but also just trying to tell the story of my own family, and my own life. And so I really only started to do that during COVID lockdown. So I had agreed to write the book, but I wasn't quite sure what the book was or how it would function. And although COVID was horrific in so many ways, it did sort of force me in on myself. I was fortunate enough we have a place on the west coast of Ireland, just on Galway Bay, and so I was able to sort of sit there every day and contemplate just how to tell the story, and just kind of finding a tone for it that would allow it to be readable by people who maybe don't know very much about Ireland or aren't that interested in it, but just might find it interesting really as an example of the way in which the modern world has unfolded.
Mm-hmm. And it starts, of course, with this mass emigration that occurred around the 1950s, with scores of people leaving Ireland for the U.S., Europe, Canada, even the U.K. That's part of why I'm here in the U.S. My grandparents left Ireland in the 1950s when they were in their 20s, and first went to Toronto, Canada, where they got married. And I read in the book that your father actually planned to move to Canada before meeting your mother. And then my grandparents went to Ohio, and then to Pasadena, California, where they built a house, and that's still in the family today. It's amazing to think about, my grandparents, that when they left in their 20s, never saw their parents again, and he went back to Ireland, I think once or twice to visit in later years. So tell us about why that mass emigrating was happening, and then why it changed.
Yeah, it's a very haunting thing you say, is that we sort of take for granted, well, you go to your side of the world, but you're going to come back, you're going to be on Zoom, you're going to, there's still this kind of connection. But I mean, it really was tragic for a lot of families, that they were broken up by mass immigration. And of course, this really had been happening in Ireland all through the 19th century, particularly after the potato famine of the 1840s, that really turned a sort of pattern of migration into a flood. And it never really stopped, I mean, Ireland was a very poor country for most of the population because you had a very, very unjust distribution of land, which was the main resource that people had at the time. Obviously, you had a landlord class, which controlled all the land, and most ordinary people were tenants on the land. It was a poor existence. So, even though they weren't going to to gold paved streets in New York or Boston, they did understand that they had a better chance of making a life for themselves and for their kids. And that pattern really continued. But by the time I was born in 1958, and at that time, it really had reached a sort of psychological crisis level, which was, remember, this state had been founded, through great difficulty and fighting against the British and all that sort of blood and trouble. And the promise was, if we only had our own state, this mass migration would stop. We would be able to do things for ourselves and make life better. And here you have it, like the world of your grandparents, where people were just getting out, and they were voting with their feet really against the viability of independent Ireland. They were kind of saying, no, it doesn't work, and that's a very profound thing to do for people who are very patriotic and fond of their country and all that kind of stuff, this really, the 50s, as people will know, was the period of rebuilding Europe and rebuilding after the Second World War. And so, every place was growing in population, the sort of repopulation of the continent after all those disasters. And only 2 countries in Europe lost population in the 1950s. One was East Germany, for kind of obvious reasons, before they built the wall, and the other was Ireland. And they couldn't build a wall around the whole island. They probably would have if they could have, but they couldn't, And the only alternative then was really to sort of radically rethink, what was independent Ireland, what was its policy, how was it going to make its way in the world. And the decision really coming from on high was that the place would have to be opened up to foreign capital, and it would have to go from being an agricultural country to being, a more urban one, to become a sort of globalized society. They maybe didn't use that word then, but really they were kind of understanding it was going to have to connect itself to the global economy. And really, that's the story that I try to tell, is really kind of what happens. How does that, not just the big picture stuff, but how does it affect real life and the way you think about the place?
And you also write vividly about the Troubles, of course, about how at first violence seemed like the only answer, or the right answer, and the only language that the British and the Protestant majority would understand in response to their civil rights abuses on the Catholics. But that over time it became complicated because the IRA started doing things like indiscriminately killing civilians, and what was it like growing up during that time? Did it feel like you were growing up in a war zone, or did it feel like normalized and commonplace?
It's a great question, because the answer is sort of both in a funny way. That I was in Dublin, and obviously the Troubles were happening in Northern Ireland, but like for Americans, it's it's like next door. The distances are almost negligible. It's a couple of hours drive. And of course, also, the Republic of Ireland, where I was from, was nationalist. It was very involved. It was very emotionally attached to the Catholic minority in Northern Ireland. And so at first, we really did feel, I tell the story in the book of my father coming home. My father was a very rational, peaceful sort of man. He wasn't a kind of emotional hothead or anything, but there was a massacre in Derry, the Bloody Sunday massacre in 1972, when the British just opened fire on unarmed demonstrators and killed 13 people. And that produced this enormous wave of emotion. But I remember my father coming home and saying to my mother, look, you're going to have to get used to the fact that myself and the boys are going to be up in the north fighting. Wow. And because it was becoming that kind of tribal civil war sort of mentality. This is what's going to happen, and it's going to go on for years, and it's going to be horrible. And then oddly enough, people sort of withdrew from that mentally. And I think for exactly the reason you were saying, which was that it got complicated morally because the IRA started doing horrific things, politically speaking, apart from the moral issue, politically speaking, it was very, very stupid, because it just alienated its kind of natural support base by, if you say, well, it was horrible for the British to massacre innocent people, and it certainly was. Why is it okay for us to massacre innocent people? Right. To put bombs in cafes and pubs, and just repeatedly doing this over and over again. But the Troubles, they're kind of scary, even looking back now for all of us, because Nobody thought in 1968 that this was going to go on for 30 years. I mean, if you said, come on, it's ludicrous, you know, you're being way over the top. And not only did it go on for 30 years, but it also kind of felt like it could have gone on for another 30 years if certain stars had aligned at a certain time, for you had a generation of people who were had been through it and didn't want to continue, you know. But if that had been passed on to their kids, to another generation, I mean, it's kind of, because it was sort of self-generating. And what it tells us is that these conflicts, they become about themselves rather than about the issues necessarily, you know. So I'm going to kill you because one of your guys killed one of my people, you know, and that sort of cycle of atrocity and counter atrocity, you know, it can just kind of continue on. So it was this very, very strange thing of, you know, because it lasted so long. I mean, maybe disgracefully, we got used to it. You know, it actually felt like it's just a reality. I mean, it was a terrible reality. Most people were sick of it, but it was only really when there were big atrocities, you know, that people paid a huge amount of attention after a while. And the sort of daily thing of, you know, another body found somewhere, it was just sort of background noise. And that's the horrible thing about these conflicts, you know, when they get going and become normalized, that you start losing your moral perspective on things a bit.
Absolutely. And what if the Republic of Ireland had started out back in the 1920s as 32 counties instead of 26? How might the country's history and identity have been different?
Again, it's a great question. You know, it's the great what if. You know, you can look back and I mean, you know, we don't have to re-argue partition. You know, and was it inevitable or whatever. But whether you think it was inevitable or not, it was tragic, right? So it did two big things in relation to the Republic of Ireland, where I grew up, right? One was, of course, it sort of made it possible for it to be an ethnic and religious monolith, right? So because of partition, the idea of pluralism and multiple identities and actually different ways of being Irish, you know, that was kind of literally hived off into the north. That's where most of the Protestant population was. And so what was left was just an overwhelmingly and frankly, you know, stultifyingly, Catholic country. Well over 90% of people were Catholic, almost all white, mostly rural. And this did produce a kind of self-satisfaction, oddly enough. So even though the place was poor and not very successful, it sort of felt like, well, we're the most Catholic country in the world, you know, we're the kind of beacon of spiritual truths to the world, you know, all that kind of nonsense. But there's being slightly flippant about it, because there's a downside to all that too, which was that how do you preserve this idea of being the most Catholic country in the world? And you preserve it by punishing women in particular. Step out of line, you know. Women have to bear the burden of being the embodiment, literal embodiment of this holiness, you know. So you had a kind of sexual puritanism, which even by the standards of the time was extreme. You had horrific institutions that enforced this, you know, so women could be locked up in things called Magdalen laundries, you know, where they were basically enslaved, you know, with no real legal process. Babies, you know, were secretly born out of wedlock in institutions, and then mothers were basically told, sign away all your rights to this baby, and we'll sell it to an American couple. I mean, which, you know, happened a lot. Terrible stuff. So the sort of that was one of the effects, which is you didn't have the pluralism that you have a kind of modern democracy, really. And the other one was economic, right? So the northeast of the country was by far the most developed economically. It was really where the concentration of industry was. It may not sound like a very good example, but people think, like, where was the Titanic built? And I know that's not a story that ended well, but remember, you know, the reason the Titanic story was such a huge story at the time was because this was like a spaceship. I mean, this was like the most advanced piece of technology that you could think of in 1912. It was built in Belfast, you know. I mean, Belfast was a really, really important hub of cutting edge technology, shipbuilding, engineering, you know, so many industries. And so when you took that away too, you know, it meant that what was left was not just a very, very Catholic country, but also a very agricultural country. Dublin, where I grew up, was sort of, had some industry, but it was pretty low level. Um, but it wasn't until 1971 that even a majority of the population was living in towns, never mind cities. I mean, it really was very, very rural. And of course, that had lovely aspects to it. There was a lot of great culture, music, storytelling, all those kind of things that go with rural societies. Um, but it was not successful economically. I mean, you can't be part of the modern world really on the basis of a largely agricultural economy.
Yeah. And do you think an Irish unity referendum will happen soon or ever happen? And do you think it should happen?
Well, I think in terms of the should question, I mean, one thing I think we should absolutely acknowledge is that it's a completely legitimate aspiration, right? So the IRA campaign, in a way, confused that because it confused it with violence and with a very coercive attitude to this. But as you say, we're 25 years on now from the Belfast Agreement, the peace deal, and peace deal was based on saying, okay, we'll park these aspirations for now in a way, but they're perfectly legitimate. People have a right to have that identity in Northern Ireland and to want Irish unity. I always said that I didn't think I would see it in my lifetime, and maybe it's just because I'm getting older and I, that time frame is getting shorter. I'm not so sure about that anymore. Brexit has made a big difference because, I mean, if you were a unionist, if you wanted Northern Ireland to stay part of the United Kingdom, as the majority of the Protestant population does, Brexit is the stupidest thing you could have done, right? Because what they didn't understand was that one of the things that actually kept the Catholic population reasonably satisfied in Northern Ireland was, well, we're all in the European Union, so I'm part of the European Union, so is my cousin who lives on the other side of the border. It sort of feels like at least there's a bigger entity of which you're a part. And of course, people in Northern Ireland voted against Brexit, but it's been forced on them in a way by a minority view, which is supported by the Protestant political parties. So it's alienated the Catholic population much, much more. But also, of course, it's ended up, ironically, sort of dividing Northern Ireland from Britain, because you had all these kind of rows, which are maybe about to be resolved, but about what would Northern Ireland's status after Brexit be. And it became clear that it had to be a different status from Britain. So Northern Ireland has stayed, in some respects, economically inside the European Union. So it means it's different from Britain. It's just, can you imagine the United States saying, well, actually, Texas can, be in a completely different economic regime, taxation regime, its trading relations, its international relations can be completely different from the rest of the United States, So it's a way of saying, actually, that you are different and, you're in a process of separation in a lot of ways. So I would think there will be a referendum in Northern Ireland within the next 10 years on Irish unity. My worry is that we're not ready for it yet, So it's one of those things that if you ask people where I come from in Dublin and you say, what do you think about Irish unity? Absolutely wonderful, terrific. I want it now, fancy, what great thing. And then you ask any other question, like, would you pay slightly higher taxes? But even like crazy stuff, if you say like, well, would you change the national anthem? No. Would you change the flag? Like once you start applying any conditions to it. And so I think people haven't got their heads around the fact that a united Ireland can't just be extending the Republic of Ireland into the north. It has to be a much larger process of reconciliation, and of recognizing that actually there are different ways of being Irish and that they're all legitimate. And so we still have quite a lot of work to do actually in terms of just talking to each other and understanding each other and getting to that point. And I would much rather that we had reconciliation before unity rather than unifying with a still very divided population.
With Brexit, are we at risk of going back to a hard border situation? And there's been a sort of uptick in violence recently, right? Mostly by loyalist paramilitaries.
Well, it's actually there's been some from street violence from loyalist paramilitaries, but there's also kind of rump IRA action. These people have very, very little public support, but sad thing we know, and it from the States too, is that very small groups of people with arms can cause mayhem, and destabilize things. So there certainly are. I wouldn't dismiss those fears at all, but I don't think we're ever going back to the Troubles, right? I mean, I just don't think anybody really wants that, or but a hard border, if it had been re-implemented, put back in place, which really is what the Brexit people wanted to do, would have been disastrous, right? Because a border is an easy target, right? So you take all those small groups, but you've got a customs official out on the border, they shoot them. Then you have to militarize the border.
Right.
And once you militarize the border, you're reminding people every day that Ireland is partitioned. Everybody's, because like at the moment, I've forgotten where the border is, right? So if I travel from Dublin to Belfast, I can vaguely remember it was somewhere around here, wasn't it? But there's no sign of it. There's no, and so keeping that was really, really important for us. So I don't want to be kind of, overly Irish patriotic about this, but it was an amazing moment because it was the first time in the entire history of British-Irish relations, which go back a long way, and when Ireland was stronger than Britain. So in the negotiations, the Brexit negotiations, Ireland had done very well. I mean, they'd actually prepared the ground very well, and they got the European Union to say, there will be no hard border. It's not going to happen, and this is an absolute priority of the entire European Union. It's not just an Irish issue. And while the British are very used to being the big dog compared to Ireland, they're not the big dog compared to the European Union. They still find this hard to get their heads around, but the European Union is a pretty big place and has a lot of power. And so to be fair, like the European Union was actually very positive in the way it treated Ireland in this whole process. It was very careful about it. So you ended up really with the border in the Irish Sea, which is, so there are checks on goods going from Britain into Northern Ireland. I mean, again, get your head around that, in terms of the implications of that, I mean, it's basically Britain saying, Northern Ireland is becoming semi-detached. And the irony is that this was a situation brought about by people who are unionists. It wasn't done by Irish nationalists. And, I was made the point that this misconceived unionist project actually did more harm to the United Kingdom as an entity and Northern Ireland's place within it than the IRA managed to do through 30 years of violence. So we're in this kind of strange situation where things have been unsettled in really quite fundamental ways, and that will play out over time.
Yeah. And the other major force you mentioned earlier in Ireland, of course, was Catholic nationalism. And I was struck by the story in the book about parents apologizing to priests when the priests abuse their kids. And meanwhile, these bishops and religious leaders pretend to be the moral arbiters of Irish society, censoring TV shows and plays. And on the other hand, they're letting priests abuse kids for decades. What is the power of the Catholic Church today?
A couple of years ago, my mother died, and she was a very fervent Catholic, very sincere believer, and the church was really important to her, and I just remember going up to the church where I describe it in the book, and it's where I used to serve mass, and it's huge church, and organizing the funeral. The priest was a really nice guy, but he was very apologetic, saying, "Look, I can't afford to heat the church. I'm sorry, it'll be cold. I can't put on the heating." And even though I'm very glad that the power of the church and the way it was broken, there's a certain kind of sadness to it. It's a hugely diminished institution, and as you say, entirely through its own fault. Well, not entirely. I mean, to be fair, of course, these processes of social change, if you go from an agricultural society to an industrial one, from countryside to the city, levels of education rise, people become religious. It just happens, but the real damage it did was entirely self-inflicted through the appalling handling of all of these child abuse scandals, and as you said, they had such power in the world I grew up in that's exactly what happened. That when parents discovered their kid had been abused, they would approach the church authorities. They wouldn't go to the police, of course. You know, they'd go apologetically, saying, "We're really, really sorry to cause you this trouble, you know, but do you think you might be able to do something about this guy?" You know, and that's when you got real power, because you're inside people's heads. You know, you make the victim feel like they're the ones to blame. You know, and that was it's a very stark example of absolute power corrupting absolutely. You know, I mean, if I was a very religious person, I mean, I would say, you know, the more religious faith you have, the further you should keep it away from temporal power, you know, from state power, because it will destroy you in the end. You know, if you fuse too many different forms of power into one entity, you get a culture of impunity, of being able to lie, of being able to, you know, get around the law, and it corrupts you from the inside, you know. And of course there were tremendous people in the church, still are, you know, people who are genuinely people of faith and great service and all that. But institutionally, it became rotten, you know, and it's still very upsetting, you know, the cynicism with which, you know, with which abusers were moved around the place. You know, it's just staggering, you know, that it's very hard for any of us to get our heads around. Like, if you knew that this guy was a pedophile, right, and this had caused so much grief in a particular parish that it had, you know, become a scandal, and then you would say, well, let's just move him to somewhere else, fresh field of kids to abuse, you know. And they just did this again and again and again over decades, you know, and then lied about it when they were challenged on it, and you know, and it's a terrible story. It really is very, very dark, you know. And it's sad for believers, like someone like my mother, you know, just have to confront the fact that these people were lying to you for so long, you know, and you know, that they didn't really practice what they preached, and very often it's the very opposite of what they were preaching.
Yeah, it is sad. And then related to that, one of the main points you make in the book is, as you mentioned earlier, the way women were treated as second-class citizens with these contraception bans and the adoption agencies, and the point you made about women fetching water for something like a third of their lives. And you made an interesting point about how even feminists believed the South was free and the North was not. But when it came to things as simple as condoms, the North was free and the South was not. That there's always this sort of double standard going on, this cognitive dissonance. Has that improved? Is it a different country today in the way it treats women?
Well, yeah. I mean, it is, you know, and I'm not for a moment saying that there's full gender equality, or, you know, that patriarchy doesn't still exist and misogyny doesn't still exist. Of course they do, but it's incomparable to what it was like when I was growing up, you know, both for women and for LGBTQ people, you know. So as you say, because you had this fusion of Catholicism and nationalism, church and state, you know, the state implemented Catholic teaching as law. So ban on contraception, ban on divorce. I mean, divorce was unconstitutional up until the 1990s. You know, abortion, of course, you know, infamously Ireland put a anti-abortion clause into its constitution in 1983. The laws under which, say, Oscar Wilde was prosecuted in the 1890s, notoriously in Britain for homosexuality, they were still in place in Ireland in the 1990s, you know. So it had this kind of nexus of very, very repressive laws around sexuality and reproduction, control of one's own body, all of that. And, you know, who would have thought that in 2015, Ireland became the first country in the world to implement equal marriage, same-sex marriage, by popular vote. You know? Other places have done it through courts or through parliaments, but actually, because of our written constitution, the court said the written constitution means that marriage is only between a man and a woman. So we had to change the constitution, and you can only do that in Ireland by everybody voting. So, you know, it was a really interesting test case, and I mean, people voted 2-1 for same-sex marriage, you know. And then 2 years later, there was a referendum to remove the ban on abortion from the Constitution. And again, it was 2-1 in favor of removing it. And so these were markers of a very profoundly changed society, you know. I mean, it's a liberal society, you know, in relation to all of those kinds of things. It's a very highly educated society, and women are even better educated than men, you know. So Ireland, I think I'm right in saying, is the best educated society in Europe now. Whereas when I was born, it was the worst educated society in Europe.
Right.
So well over half of people have a college degree, third level degree.
Yeah, it seems to have done this pretty remarkable 180 transformation from in a short period of time, really. A few years ago, Ireland opened up a new consulate in Los Angeles, and they've been really pushing this idea of global Ireland. They have an annual week-long celebration of Irish culture called Ireland Week. Do you have any experiences, interactions with the growing Irish diaspora in LA or on the West Coast? Or are you mostly plugged into the East Coast because you're at Princeton?
I'm mostly on the East Coast. I've been a couple of times to San Francisco. I think has an Irish festival, which is lovely. That was great, but I'd love to get to LA for a festival or something. You know, I was very touched when you were talking about your own grandparents, you know, and your own sense of Irishness. And I see you're wearing a great Ireland shirt, you know. And it's one of the most positive and progressive things too, you know, is for generations really we buried the pain of emigration, mass emigration, by saying that's you're gone, you know, that's it. And it was a very distorting thing for families, but also for the nation. Like, who's Irish? Who has the right to be Irish? You know, and it's always very moving to me coming here, you know, to the States, that so many people actually have an Irish heritage and they're proud of it, and it's important to them, and it's, you know, it's part of their own identity. It doesn't make them not American. And for me, it's a great lesson in the fact that actually, you know, right-wing conservatives always think of culture and identity as something that's been just kind of given to us from the past, and it's fixed. And therefore, the only thing can happen to it, of course, is you know, it's going to be diluted or taken away from us. You know, it's this really attitude. And actually, the Irish story is a really fascinating story of how, through transformation and change and dealing with new circumstances, the culture has actually grown, you know, has become more global. It is in LA, it's in, you know, it's everywhere, and it's not any less Irish for any of that. It's more so, I think, you know, and you know, our sense of connection to the Irish diaspora, I think, is one of the things that's just transformed itself as well in the last 20 years, and that, you know, for me is a really, really healthy thing for both sides. I mean, I think it's very good for people of Irish heritage in the States to have a sense that Irish people recognize them as Irish, you know. But I think it's also very good for us, you know, because it makes us aware of the fact that our identity has this kind of plural side to it. You know, you can have a hyphen in your identity. You can, you know, it's fine. It's not subtracting. It's adding.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I really appreciated being able to, you know, get Irish citizenship through my grandparents. And, you know, it's not every country has it set up that way. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join me and speak with me. It's a really interesting book. Everyone should go read it. Not just Irish people or Irish Americans. There's, as you said, something about the Irish story that speaks to the larger human experience, and your book is a really good exploration of that. So, we don't know ourselves. Fintan O'Toole, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that conversation. Thank you.
Okay, before we go, let's check in with our senior influencer correspondent, Bradford.
Hey everybody, it's Brad. Just wanted to tell you about my amazing day that I had today. 3 amazing things happened to me like at the same place, and I just had to share it with you. First of all, number 1, I met Elijah Wood. Well, I didn't really meet him. I walked by him, and I didn't actually see him, but someone told me that I walked by him. Second of all, I got to see Ry Cooder, the legendary guitarist, play. I walked up to the stage right when he was packing up and getting ready to leave. And then number 3, this is the most exciting, John C. Reilly, didn't see him, but he was at the event that I was at, and he played. I had to leave before he played with his band. But so awesome. What a great day. Hope that influenced you guys. Love you.
Thank you for that report, Bradford. Thank you all for watching this 20th episode of Well Read with Justin Chapman. Learn more at justindouglaschapman.com and sign up for my free monthly email newsletter at justinchapman.substack.com. And remember, a life well read is a life well spent. So go read a book. Till next time.